Investment and banking group Old Mutual having fired its CEO Peter Moyo. Old Mutual had suspended Moyo in May following what the group calls a material breakdown in trust and confidence. The company says there were prior engagements with Moyo following concerns about how a conflict of interest had been managed regarding his investments in NMT Group of companies. For the latest on the axing of Moyo, we're joined by our Economics Anchor Arabile Gumede. A very warm welcome. We used to have these interactions about the national scene in terms of the economy and business, and we haven't done it in a while. We should
certainly haven't.
Rekindle that.
I think a lot has sort of happened. Of course, things like state capture have taken precedence, and of course other inquiries as well. But I think this one obviously requires more of an in-depth look.
Arabile, what makes this a story? When Peter Moyo has declared his involvement in NMT right from the beginning, prior to employment, how did we get here?
So it's actually a long-winded story, but one that is in itself very fascinating, because yes, he did declare that he has, of course, a holding in NMT Capital. He founded the investment company itself, right? And in 2004, Old Mutual had bought a 20% stake in NMT Capital, right? So NMT Capital was founded by Sangon Aluba and Peter Moyo themselves. They're currently still, of course, directors in the company, with one other person as well holding some sort of ownership in the company. And now what has happened is that in the 2018 financial year, NMT Capital declared a dividend of 115 million rand in total for the financial year. Now, what that actually meant was that the directors themselves actually would get a large portion of that, and with Peter Moyo's holding in the company, he would get a 30.6.
It almost seemed like double dipping.
Exactly. So he would get a dividend of 30.6 million from that 115. Now, the question was, however, that up until that stage, preference shares, which were then supposed to be given to Old Mutual, had not yet been paid. And the question then is, if we are owed money as preference shareholders, how is it that you are able to then declare a first dividend and a second dividend? The second dividend was for 105 million, the first then being for 10 million, and together 115 million. So the scenario itself was, you're paying yourselves, yet you actually haven't paid us yet. Where's your fiduciary duty to Old Mutual, which is the company you are CEO of?
It's common business practice, though, isn't it, to get the officials of a company that a bigger firm would acquire to bring them into the bigger operation. Where are the conflicts there?
Well, so the conflict in here is really not even within Peter Moyo owning, portions of this business. As you say, it is common business practice to have perhaps the ownership, one who owns a smaller entity, to then, move into a bigger entity to be able to help the interests of both parties. But in this scenario, it would just seem that Peter Moyo only helped his own interests. And that is the big conflict here. To say that you're paying yourself out this large sum of money, and yet you're forgetting about us. You haven't actually paid us as your preference shareholders. We have a 20% stake in this company, and yet you still haven't paid us. So where is our money? And they deemed it to be an irregular expenditure and really declared it in breach of Old Mutual's rights as their preference shareholder.
So where a viewer is watching right now and wondering, what did Peter Moyo do wrong? What would be your answer?
He basically took money out of a company that is partially owned by Old Mutual and decided not to pay Old Mutual the money they deserved in the process. So they were owed money, that is Old Mutual, and Old Mutual was not paid the money. Who is responsible for paying Old Mutual? In this case, the person who's the director of that company, being Peter Moyo, who's also the CEO of the very same company, Old Mutual.
What was Old Mutual's responsibility in all of this to make sure to create a proper system that allows for their payments to be effected either automatically or without having to hackle for it?
So Old Mutual already has a regulation in place which governs the entire shareholding of another company. If you are the CEO, chairman, director of any kind within another company or within Old Mutual itself. And what that regulation in itself says, that every company needs to declare just how much they are giving away. Doesn't necessarily mean that Old Mutual is giving that money, but it's the question about how you, as fiduciary duty to us, are going to be able to be willing to give. Now, the problem is that Peter Moyo did not actually declare the amount that would have been given to himself, and the total amount as a dividend.
So that's where the problem is.
So the investigation into it brought up the sum.
He was suspended in May already.
Yeah.
Has he been able to give some sort of justification as to how he went about this process?
So Old Mutual themselves say they have not been given a sufficient discussion point around it. They actually say that they tried to find an agreed separation and no agreement was found. The board has not been given an acceptable explanation why ordinary dividends were declared whilst debt to Old Mutual was still outstanding. So they believe, and of course remember that preference shares come before ordinary shares, right? And this was an ordinary share that was given then to Peter Moyo, but the preference shareholders are those that come first.
That's why I'm sitting here thinking he might have a legal standing, but I could be wrong.
I think in this case he certainly doesn't have a legal standing, and I'll say that purely because the preference shareholders come before ordinary dividend holders. And if you're going to issue shares, you have to make sure that they're paid first. So Old Mutual definitely needed to be paid first. If not, at the very least, should have been declared.
So in their statement today, Old Mutual refers to recent corporate governance breakdowns within both private and public sector. How does this one event speak to the general national conversation?
The question that will certainly be asked is, who can we rely on? Who can we trust then in the global or in the national spectrum to lead?
National more than anything.
Exactly, right.
Because that conversation, we have the State Capture Commission taking place right now, and these kind of revelations are coming out.
It's certainly, and this is going to be part and parcel of all of that, right? How is it that you are not willing to declare such things? And if you are, why are you not following rules to the letter? Why is it that you believe that you have a greater preference to other people when you know how preference shareholdings work? Right? So it's very weird when a guy who's been involved in the financial sector itself has perhaps not been willing to understand the rules quite vehemently. We are trying to get a hold of Sango Nzaluba as well.
Actually, I wanted to say to you, we recently spoke to Sango Nzaluba, because he wrote an article in a Sunday newspaper about the seeming effort to make black executives look like they're not capable when it's actually the opposite.
This speaks directly
to his firm.
It certainly does. And if I mean, I can believe that this would probably go to law in some way or other. But let's just imagine that Peter Moyo does walk away from this deal in total, from the CEO position, of course, at Old Mutual. There's a high chance that he'd have to be paid out. So he gets paid out of that, plus he gets the 30 million out of NMT Capital. He walks away and nothing would have happened. Nobody would have actually answered to the scenario. So my question then, I suppose, in total is, I think it is very necessary that he gives a clarification, because again, we may be speaking just from Old Mutual side. He needs to give his side of the story and really connect the dots in some way or other, and hopefully then, dispel what we're basically getting out of this, which is that there are still very many unreliable executives in South Africa's corporate sector.
We're speaking about the individual here, but how does this speak to the shareholding of NMT within Old Mutual?
So, it's the weird thing that Old Mutual have not said what they would do with regards to NMT Capital, whether they'll continue to own shares in the company. But I can guarantee you one thing is that the first and foremost, they would want their money. Right, out of this entire situation, as preference dividend shareholders, they deserve their money first. And from there, I'm pretty sure that they would relook their investment into NMT Capital and see whether it would be profitable for them. How much of that business actually aids them in any way? Does it give them a base in terms of customers that aren't necessarily available to Old Mutual? So I certainly think it will be something that will be vastly questioned rather over the next few days.
A developing story, I imagine, with so many dimensions.
We'll have more on it, of course.
Thank you so much for giving us some sense of clarity as to what the story is all about. Arabile Gumede, our economics anchor. Now,